The Man with a Chip on His Shoulder. One day, a man woke up and there was a huge chip on his shoulder. "Typical," he moaned. "It always happens to me." The end. The giant who grew too big for his boots. Not so long ago, there lived a giant named Hugh who lived in a tiny cottage in Wales. He was known as Huge Hugh because his hands were the size of dustbin lids and his feet were as long as a pair of skis. He had a mop of tangly black hair on top of his head and another mop of dangly black hair growing off his chin. What was left of his face was covered in warts. His tongue was purple and swollen from all the eating that he did, and when he talked, it stuck out between his lips and sprayed the room with spittle from ceiling to floor. His wife used to carry an umbrella to keep herself dry. Hugh was always shouting at her, and the walls of their cottage were permanently wet. "Fetch me a cow sandwich," he would dribble, "or else I shall sit on top of you and turn you into meat paste." Huge Hugh was a big bully with an enormous appetite. One morning, after a light breakfast of 27 buckets of cereal, 14 apple trees, and a bar full of tea, Hugh leaned back in his chair and roared, "I need more space!" His wife didn't get her umbrella up in time and got soaked. "Why?" she said, drying herself with a tea towel. "Because this cottage isn't big enough," shouted Hugh. "When I take a bath, my toes stick up the plugs. When I eat at the kitchen table, my elbows knock the china off the sideboard, and I can't get into the toilet. I need more space." Huge Hugh left the cottage in a rush, banging his head on the back door as he went. He stood outside his neighbour's house and shouted, "Mr. Sparrow!" for that was his neighbour's name. A timid little man wearing gum boots and a woolly hat appeared round the side of the house. "Yes," he said. Hugh looked down at this weedy specimen. "Are you Sparrow?" he said. Mr. Sparrow ducked and ran for cover as Hugh's spittle shot from his mouth like bullets from a machine gun. "Yes," replied a distant voice. "Super," he said. "I'm Huge Hugh, and unless you give me your house, I'll stand here all day and say a lot of things beginning with S." "If you do that, you'll spit my house down," said the distant voice. "Exactly," said Hugh. Then he started. "Seashells, seashells on the seashore, the seashells, the seashells, the seashells for sure." Seconds later, Mr. Sparrow and his family wadded out of the back door wearing macintoshes and shoe resters. Hugh moved in directly they had gone. He threw all their furniture into the road to make more space and went to sleep in the large room downstairs. It hadn't been a large room before Hugh moved in. In fact, it had been the sitting room, the dining room, the kitchen, playroom, and study. Hugh had simply knocked a few walls down. When he woke up, something very strange had happened. He had grown bigger. His head had swollen to 10 times its normal size and was poking through the roof. His legs were sticking out of the windows, and his feet were now as long as railway carriages. "I need more space!" roared Hugh. A thin spray of spittle squirted skyward from his mouth. In a nearby village, a freak rainstorm swept through the high street, soaking everything in its path. It lasted for 15 seconds and ruined everybody's washing. Hugh wiped his lips, brushed the chimney pot off his nose, and looked around for somewhere bigger to stay. In the distance, behind a long line of trees, a thin trail of white smoke snaked up into the sky. Forgetting that he was still inside Mr. Sparrow's house, Hugh stood up. The house was torn from its foundations and clung to Hugh's chest and arms like a brick-coloured waistcoat. Beyond the trees, he could see 2 villagers perched on top of 2 hills. "Mine," thought Huge Hugh. He stepped over the trees and approached the villagers. The streets were deserted. He couldn't see any sign of life. Hugh laughed out loud. Too scared to face me, eh? A little voice spoke up from somewhere near Hugh's knees. If you have to shout, then go and do it somewhere else. Who said that? Said Hugh, showering the surrounding fields of wheat. I did, said the voice again. Down here. Hugh kneeled down and came face to face with an angry vicar who was hanging out of the church belfry. I am trying to conduct a service for these good village folk, said the vicar. Well, I am trying to find somewhere to sleep, said Hugh, putting his nose next to the vicar's head and spraying him clean out of the bell tower. Shove off, Hugh! Shouted the villagers from inside the church. Hugh peeled off the roof and put his eye close up to the congregation. Shove off yourselves! He spat. The villagers swam to safety. Hugh had found somewhere warm to spend the night. Hugh wriggled into the 2 town halls, laid his head on a municipal library, and kept his toes warm by putting each of them into a separate greenhouse. There was plenty of room in 2 whole villages for him to get comfy. In the middle of the night, however, he woke up with a start. He was freezing. It felt as if somebody had pulled the cover off him. Hugh opened an eye. He could see the stars. He opened the other eye. There was the moon. He had grown again. His head was higher than the clouds, and 2 villagers were clustered round his ankles like a pair of unlaced boots. I need more space! Roared Hugh. A huge spray of spittle shot skywards from his mouth. In nearby Scotland, a freak rainstorm swept the length and breadth of the country, soaking everything in its path. It lasted for 3 minutes and ruined everybody's hairdos. Hugh wiped his lips and looked around him for somewhere bigger to stay. In the distance, at the end of a long straight road, a pocket of bright lights beckoned. Hugh took over the city of London. He sprawled in Hyde Park. He drank water from the Thames. He ate pigeons by the handful from Trafalgar Square. No sooner had he claimed the city as his own, however, than he grew again, and every time he got bigger, he needed more space. After London, it was Bristol, then Manchester, Liverpool, Hull, and Edinburgh. By the time he had a toe in Ireland, Hugh was 600 miles high. Still, he kept roaring, I need more space! Still, he kept spraying. Great Britain was having the wettest April in living memory. People were trading their cards in for luxury yachts and rowing boats. The President of the United States of America phoned Huge Hugh up. Hugh, he said. Hugh, baby, I hear you want to move into America.
That's right,
replied Hugh,
in a big way.
Well, excuse me, Hugh, said the President nervously, but I have to warn you that you take one step towards the United States, and I'll be forced to send airplanes and rockets after you, to knock you out the sky. Hugh laughed and slammed the receiver down. When you're as big as a country, you don't have to listen to anyone. After a quick snack of 3,000 sheep and 4 fields of carrots, Hugh took a couple of paces to the right and crossed the Atlantic Ocean as if they were no bigger than a puddle. True to his word, the American president sent up every aeroplane and rocket in his possession. Hugh ate them all for pudding.
I need more space!
Roared Hugh. An absolutely enormous spray of spittle gushed skyward from his mouth. In nearby Africa, a freak rainstorm swept the length and breadth of the continent, soaking everything in its path. It lasted for 6 hours and ruined everybody's crops. Hugh wiped his lips and looked around him for somewhere bigger to stay. The rest of the world was very nervous. Hugh was growing at such an alarming rate that he was no longer Huge Hugh. He was absolutely ginormous, towering, can't see his head for the clouds Hugh. When he went to sleep at night, he put his feet in Australia, his bottom in India, and his head on a light pillow of snow in Antarctica. He spanned the globe. There wasn't a part of the earth that didn't belong to him. After a fortnight of almost constant growing and spittle spraying, Hugh found himself in the farthest corner of the universe. He had outgrown the moon and the sun. He had rocketed past Mars and Jupiter. He had eaten the Milky Way on his way, though. He was all alone. Millions and millions of miles from home. Roared Hugh, but there was no more space. He had taken every little bit of space going in the whole galaxy and beyond. Then he had a visitor. An unmanned satellite had been sent up from Earth. It buzzed around Hugh's nose and annoyed him. "Are you huge, Hugh?" said the computer on the satellite.
No, I'm everything in the universe, Hugh, and I need more space,
said Hugh. "Do stop saying that," said the satellite.
What?
Said Hugh. "I need more space," replied the satellite.
Do you?
Said Hugh.
So do I.
"No, we'd like you to stop saying that,"
Why?
said Hugh. "Because every time you do, you spray the entire universe, and it rains non-stop on Earth for 5 days. People are going mad down there. They're scared of drowning."
What do I care?
Said Hugh.
Let them drown. I need more space.
And he grabbed the satellite before he could escape.
I'm going to eat you now,
Said Hugh. "I wouldn't do that," said the satellite. "I'm covered in spiky aerials. If you bite on one of them, a great big windbag like you is going to burst."
A great big windbag. I'll show you a great big windbag,
said Hugh, and he popped the satellite, which was no bigger than a Malteser, into his mouth. He chewed for a moment, and then suddenly, pop! One of the satellite aerials pricked Hugh's tongue. Like an enormous balloon losing all its air, huge Hugh shriveled and shrank his way back down to Earth, back past the stars, back through the clouds, back to where he had once lived with his poor, long, suffering wife. When he had stopped growing smaller, he was no bigger than a matchstick. It was raining hard as Hugh picked himself out of the mud. He was soaked through. He needed to find somewhere warm and dry to sleep. He stood on a mushroom to get a better view and saw a snail grazing lazily on a nearby leaf. Hugh jumped off his mushroom and pushed his way through the grass. He pulled himself up to his full height of nearly 5 centimeters and said,
"I'm huge, Hugh."
"Really?" said the snail, who was not interested.
"I need more space,"
squeaked Hugh. The snail wiped his eye where Hugh had spat.
"I want that house on your back."
"Really?" said the snail. "So do I." Then he slid up to Hugh and slimed all over him.
"Oh,"
said teeny tiny Hugh as he lay on the grass unable to move for snail's jelly. He never asked for more space again. The weather got better too.